1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam? Welcome to the week 12 edition of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host. I am your guest. I am JMToWin. As always, throw this baby on 1.5x speed or 2x speed. And let's get started with an under the weather solo podcast. I got a sinus cold that I picked up a couple days ago from my daughter. Solo podcast, so we'll see. I might slide off screen at some point to mute the mic and blow my nose, but maybe we'll be able to power through without any of that. So very interesting week 12 slate. We got 10 games on this slate. So for those of you who are new here, which even at this point in the season is sometimes some of you, for those of you who are new here, every week in DFS is basically its own puzzle that we have to solve. DFS is not a game of picking players. DFS is a game of strategy. DFS is a game of game theory. DFS is a game of understanding how to maximize our pathways to a first place finish, because first place is where most of the money is in tournaments. So we always want to be thinking about how we're building for a first place finish. And a lot of times the first step to that is not who looks like good plays on the slate, but instead is what is the shape of this slate? So my DFS interpretations throughout the week on 1 week season break down my thoughts, my DFS thoughts on each game on the slate. My player grid, which comes out on Friday night in the scroll, goes through my tight player pool for the week. But the Angles podcast, we like to really take this opportunity to zoom out a little bit and look at the state of the slate, kind of look at the picture on the puzzle box, so that as we go into our builds, we have a clearer understanding of how the week shapes up and what it might take to win a tournament on this particular week. So with that, let's dive in. First thing to note on this slate, we got 20 teams playing. Only 4 teams are implied to top 25 points. So Vegas implied team totals, only 4 teams are implied to top 25 points. Those 4 teams are the Chiefs at 27 points. They are 11-point favorites at Carolina. Next up, we have the Lions at 28.75 points. They're 7.5-point favorites at Indy. The Commanders at 27.5 points as 10-point favorites at home against Cooper Rush and the Dallas Cowboys. And the Dolphins at 26.75 as 7-point favorites at home against New England. So let me read through those again. Chiefs, 11-point favorites. Lions, 7.5-point favorites. Commanders, 10-point favorites. Dolphins, 7-point favorites. 11, 7.5, 10, 7. Then we have the Packers implied for 24.75 at home against San Francisco. And every other team, every other offense on the slate is implied to score 24 or fewer real life points. So where we usually get pass game upside is through competitive game environments that lead to heavy volume. So when you have a back and forth type of game, you have these 2 teams who are having to stay aggressive throughout, and they end up throwing the ball a lot more. That matters in PPR scoring on DraftKings, or even half PPR scoring on FanDuel, because the more volume you have, if a quarterback throws 3 touchdown passes on 22 pass attempts, that's going to be a lot less valuable for us in DFS than a quarterback who throws 3 touchdown passes on 40 pass attempts, because those 40 pass attempts create that many more opportunities for pass catchers to pile up 1 point here, 1 point there, 1 point there, to pile up the yards. And so passing volume ends up mattering quite a bit. And there is the theory of, well, if a team scores 27 points, if a team scores 30 points, they probably got you a lot of points on the way up. But blowout wins are a lot likelier to produce solid scores in DFS than to produce tournament winners. So if it's a week where there are no tournament winning scores being produced across the board, which has happened this year in DFS, if it's a week like that, then yeah, those solid scores can be enough to win you a tournament. But if it is a week in which tournament winning scores are being produced, where guys are going for 4.5x their salary, where guys are going for 30, 35 points, well, then those guys who are just getting you those points on the way up are probably not going to help you win a tournament. So there is a core exception to this idea of you really want a competitive back and forth game environment. You really don't just want a blowout win. You don't want a comfortable win. And that exception, we saw it play out last week, where the Lions ended up basically just using that game against the Jags as live game reps. This is a team that all season long, if they've been controlling a game, they have been limiting their passing volume. If they have been controlling a game, it has been negative EV for us in DFS to be chasing the passing attack on this offense. So it was very easy to go into last week and say, okay, well, I remember like listening to different podcasts whether it's Check the Mic or whether it's Sims Unbuttoned or wherever else, right? Where they're picking against the spread last week. And everybody was like, man, 14 points is a huge spread. And yet I'm picking the Lions because they're just that much better than the Jags, right? So in a game environment like that, it was very reasonable to expect the Lions to do what they've done all season and just kind of lean on the ground game for Jared Goff to throw the ball 22 or fewer times. And then the Lions started out that game with 3 rushing touchdowns. They were ahead 21-3 or 21-6. And so it's very easy to think that, okay, there goes the Lions passing attack. No opportunity for the Lions passing attack to post tournament winners. And then the Lions kind of decided like, look, we have a whole game ahead of us. Let's keep playing, right? The Jags are not going to stop us. So let's get some live game reps, see if we can continue to play this game without stopping ourselves, without making mistakes, and just have a high-end game all the way across the board. And what we ended up seeing was, Goff only threw 29 pass attempts, but that was quite a bit for what he typically throws in a game environment like that. Goff threw 4 touchdown passes, and they all came after the Lions jumped out to this big lead with 3 rushing touchdowns. Amon-Ra St. Brown typically does not see volume. He doesn't see the type of volume that he saw last week, even when Goff is throwing 33, 35 times, right? All of a sudden last week, he throws only 29 times, and Amon-Ra St. Brown sees 11 targets, ended up going 11 catches, 161 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And it just seemed like this opportunity for the Lions to say, okay, like we're in control of this game, but we're still charging toward a Super Bowl that we would like to win this year. Every opportunity to get live game reps is an opportunity for us to get better. Let's just continue calling our game. Let's continue playing this game out and continue to get better, put some stuff on film, some things that we can learn from, some things that we can grow from, sharpen up the things that we do well. And they ended up putting up this huge game across the board, right? Hard to see it coming. I was in some of my contests that were like under 1,000 entries last week. I was looking up at the tops of the leaderboards to be like, man, I wonder how many people got this Lions stack. None. 0% owned Lions stacks up at the top because people just weren't thinking about this at being a type of situation where the Lions could call the game this way. So a couple things. One, that reminds us that anytime we see these super high total offenses, if we want to bet on them saying, oh, maybe they get there on the way up, that's one thing, but that's probably not going to win us a tournament. If we instead want to say, maybe this team dominates this game and plays like the 07 Patriots, plays like the Week 11 Lions, and just continues calling their offense deep into this game regardless of the score, then we have this opportunity to really pile up points. So obviously this just happened last week, and so it can be easy to assume that this might happen again, whereas realistically this is something we don't see that often across the NFL. But if it were to happen again this week, the Kansas City Chiefs seem like the team likeliest to have that type of game. Kansas City as huge favorites playing on the road against Carolina. Well, Kansas City, obviously, they're Super Bowl contender, so they check that box. Kansas City's 9-1, but realistically, they could just as easily be 5-5 this year, right? Several of their wins have been one play difference between a win and a loss, whether it was Isaiah Likely's toe in the back of the end zone, or whether it was the blocked field goal against the Broncos, an overtime game, a penalty call that changed the end of one of these games. So the Chiefs are on this knife's edge, right? Where they're winning games because they have what you would call championship DNA. They're winning games because they're making the big plays in the right moments, but they're not dominating teams the way that their record would imply. The typical 9-1 team, you would expect them to be a team that's completely dominating opponents. Well, Kansas City also lost Rashee Rice early in the season. Travis Kelce had his slow start to the season. Kansas City traded for DeAndre Hopkins. Kansas City is trying to grow and integrate Xavier Worthy. And so there's certainly an opportunity here for Kansas City to say, okay, we've taken control of this game, but shouldn't we just keep getting some live game reps here? Maybe Patrick Mahomes still throws the ball 35 to 38 times in this spot. Maybe we're able to pile up volume here. Maybe Kansas City says, let's get Xavier Worthy going here. Let's throw the ball to him 7-8 times instead of 5-6 times on some downfield throws. And so I think that this Kansas City team is an interesting team to think about in that bucket where we were able to, or where we could have looked at the Lions last week of teams that, yes, they're going to control this game. It probably won't be competitive, but maybe it will be so uncompetitive that Kansas City says, hey, we've got a lot to sharpen up. let's use these live game reps to continue developing our offense. And so I think stacking Kansas City, one of these ways where on this slate where it's been like this across the board this season, you just kind of play the chalk and you're probably not topping 160, 170 DraftKings points. So most rosters are probably going to be in that range. So if you get this one spot that ends up elevating far above that, you end up far ahead of the field. And so this Kansas City offense, one of those to think about where we could have something like that. Next game that I want to bring up from this list of teams with these broad spreads, and one team has a high implied team total, but the game is not expected to be competitive. Well, the other, I don't see other spots where one of these teams might just dominate the game so thoroughly that they're like, you know what, let's not even worry about this team coming back. Let's just run our offense and get live game reps. I don't see other opportunities for that. But I do see an opportunity for one of these games to be competitive. So the Dolphins are 7-point favorites, but isn't there a scenario in which Drake May plays well in this spot and this game is actually competitive? So Drake May has had this sort of broad range of outcomes in the way that he's playing. So obviously he's running the ball, he's picking up points on the ground, but when he's throwing it, he is in this Jameis Winston mode where he's willing to take risks down the field. So if those risks don't pay off, then those are interceptions that kill a drive, and then the Dolphins are perhaps in the lead and they're up 10 points and Drake May is throwing an interception, and the Dolphins aren't saying, oh, there's no way the Patriots can come back. Let's just keep calling pass plays. Let's just keep running our offense, right? Maybe the Dolphins are saying, all right, now we've got the lead. We're in control of this game. Let's run the ball. Let's take some time off the clock. Let's basically put additional pressure. If we can score a field goal on this drive, we can even score a touchdown on this drive and take 6 or 7 minutes off. That puts that much more pressure on Drake May to make more mistakes, right? That's certainly part of how this game could play out. But another way this game could play out is Drake May takes some risks, downfield throws, and ends up hitting on them. And all of a sudden, this becomes this competitive game where Drake May and the Dolphins are going back and forth. And if that ends up happening, we have this spot where Patriots defense has not been good. You got these extremely explosive pieces on the Dolphins in Devon Achane, Tyreek Hill, even Jalen Waddle, where, okay, now this is a competitive game. Now the Dolphins are having to throw the ball. Now they're having to run their offense throughout against a defense that they can attack. So this game really hinges on Drake May. But if Drake May is able to come in and have a good game, tough spot, right? You've been practicing in New England weather, and now you're traveling down to Miami deep into the season. Patriots have traditionally done really poorly in this game at Miami deep in the season. It's just a very hard transition to make. But what if they're able to do it, right? And Drake May is able to keep this game competitive. Then all of a sudden you have this spot where Drake May has a lot of upside because he's taking shots downfield and he's running the ball. He can throw for 300 plus yards. He can rush for 50 or 60 yards. He can rush for a touchdown. And then on the other side, you got these explosive pieces. So I think this is a very interesting game to pay attention to on a slate that doesn't have a lot of interesting games to pay attention to. 4 teams with high implied team totals are all in spots where they're expected to win handily. And then every other team on the slate is expected to be a lower scoring team. So it's either everything plays out the way that the Vegas lines are painting things, and we've got 6 games where no team really emerges for a high-end score, and you're just kind of hoping to guess right on the individual player who will have a big game from these teams. And you got 4 teams that dominate their games, and that doesn't really lead to any massive scores. And we just have kind of flat scoring across the board. Or that could end up being the case in 9 of these 10 games or 8 of these 10 games where they play to the Vegas implied totals, they play to expectations, and then you have the 1 game or the 2 games that play out differently. And in that case, being on those, now, there's also obviously within the range of outcomes is like 3 or 4 of these games play out differently. And then it matters less that you got the 1 exact game because now you're competing against people who got another one of these games right and people who got another one of these games right. But if only 1 or 2 of these games goes dramatically outside of what Vegas is expecting, then you have the situation where everything's kind of low scoring across the board, and then there's this 1 game or this 1 offense that elevates above everything else. So think about last week, if Jonnu Smith hadn't hit, and if Taysom Hill hadn't hit, if Brock Bowers hadn't hit, and you don't have these opportunities across the board for these high scores to emerge, and then you just have the Lions offense. Well, then literally being on the Lions offense was going to be the one thing required in order to win a tournament last week. So we're kind of looking for, is there a scenario like that could develop? So Kansas City keeping their foot on the gas is one scenario that could develop. New England and Miami becoming a competitive game environment is one of these scenarios that could develop. And then the next game that could become competitive is the Lions and the Colts. And it's kind of the Shane Steichen effect, where Shane Steichen, if you're not familiar with Shane Steichen, he was the offensive coordinator for the Chargers during Justin Herbert's rookie year. He was the offensive coordinator for the Eagles when Jalen Hurts first emerged, and then obviously came over to the Colts as the head coach. He was the offensive coordinator last year when Anthony Richardson went down and the Colts came one game shy of the playoffs, actually one play shy of making the playoffs with Gardner Minshew under center. All of the narratives heading into this year about the Texans being a potential Super Bowl team, right? If the Colts had won that game last year on that one play, Tyler Goodson dropped a pass, all of a sudden the Colts win that division, the Colts go to the playoffs, the Texans don't. Like, the narratives are totally different around these two teams heading into the season. So Shane Steichen is basically, regardless of who his quarterback is, he is able to adapt his offense to that quarterback. He is able to basically say, what does this quarterback do well? Let's call the offense that way. So that's something he actually talked about with Jalen Hurts was, I don't want to call an offense that I would call for a different type of quarterback. I want to design my offense around Jalen Hurts' strengths. And that's part of what made that Jalen Hurts, Shane Steichen Super Bowl bound offense so good. And so with Anthony Richardson, we had this unique situation where he's kind of the future of the franchise, or potentially the future of the franchise, right? They drafted him 4th overall last year. So they can't just put Anthony Richardson in there and say, all right, let's just call something to Anthony Richardson's strengths, because they also need him to develop. They need him to become somebody who can consistently hit the passes that he needs to be able to consistently hit, somebody who can run the offense. So it seemed very much like early in the season, and Hyla's talked about this on recent podcasts as well, but early in the season, it seemed like the Colts were saying, okay, like, let's develop Anthony Richardson. Let's get Anthony Richardson playing like a real NFL quarterback. And then it was like, okay, we need to sit Anthony Richardson. We're still in the playoff hunt. It was the game against the Texans where, he completed like 40% of his passes and he took himself out of the game at some point. And it was like, the game was so close. It's like, man, if we just had Joe Flacco in here, we'd probably win this game. We're in the playoff hunt. We got to keep the locker room. Let's put Flacco in. So they put Flacco in, but then a couple tough matchups. Flacco loses both those games. And then it becomes a thing of like, okay, now we might be out of the playoff hunt. Now we look to the future again. Let's put Anthony Richardson in. But also, maybe we got an outside shot at still making the playoffs this year. The AFC is pretty thin in that 7-7 spot, right? There's an outside chance that the Colts make the playoffs this year. So what if we also, put Anthony Richardson in, but just kind of call the game to what Anthony Richardson can do well right now. So it was actually very interesting. Last week, Anthony Richardson completed 20 out of 30 passes, 67%. That's not normal for Anthony Richardson. So is that a function of the way that they call this offense? Is that something that's going to go away? I don't know, right? But what we do know is that Shane Steichen is very good, regardless of who the quarterback is, at keeping games competitive. So the Lions are a dramatically better team on paper than the Colts, but also it shouldn't totally shock us if this becomes a competitive game. So where does that help us on the Indy side? Maybe you can play Anthony Richardson. Maybe you can play some of his pass catchers. Jonathan Taylor's going to have a tough path to upside against this really tough run defense of the Lions. But also, maybe that just swings us over to the Lions side, where I don't want to necessarily bet on the Lions controlling this game so thoroughly that they just say, hey, let's use this as live practice reps against a real life NFL team. I don't think that that's going to happen against the Colts. But the Colts could keep this game competitive enough that the Lions are having to call an actual game throughout, right? Where Jared Goff is having to throw it 30 times, where Sam Laporta is getting involved, or Amon-Ra St. Brown is having another big game, or Jameson Williams is hitting for some big plays. So I certainly think that this game is another game where we could draw up a picture of this game being competitive and us being able to benefit in DFS as a result. And then we've hit on the Chiefs. We've hit on these two games, the Patriots and Dolphins, the Lions and Colts, that could actually be more competitive than the Lions for these games that apply. Then we also have a couple games that could end up being competitive with a couple offenses that are capable of piling up points. So we're going to start with the one that stands out the most of these two games, and that is Arizona at Seattle. So both teams in this game are implied for 23.75 points. But both of these teams scoring in the mid to low 20s is probably the least likely scenario. So just a quick little refresher on how Vegas totals work and Vegas lines work. So every once in a while, Vegas, we say Vegas still, even though now it's, sports books in general, but every once in a while, Vegas will take a stand on a spot where 80% of the money is on this team, but Vegas still leaves the line where it is. And they're basically saying, you know what, we think that we're right on this. And maybe we'll be wrong on the small sample size of 1 week, but if at an 80-20 differential, right, where we think we're right with the line being right here and only 20% of the money thinks that we're right, like over time, we're going to make money by just keeping the line here in situations like this. That happens every once in a while where Vegas just takes a stand. But most of the time, the goal for Vegas is to get 50% of the money on either side of the bets. And that's kind of how the lines move is we're getting 50%, we're up to 45%, down to 45% here, 55% here. So the line moves a little bit because by the end of the week, we want to get 50% of the money on either side of the bet. Vegas takes the vig and they're guaranteed to make money over time. So that's why lines tend to be pretty efficient. Every once in a while, the quote man in Vegas will say, no, we're going to take a stand here. 85% of the money is on this side, but that's okay. We're not moving the line. But most of the time, they're just saying, let's just get 50% on either side. So a lot of times the line can tell us a lot about how a game is likely to play out, but there's also a broad range of outcomes around a line. So Arizona-Seattle, 47.5 point over-under. There are games with 47.5 point totals where most of the time, think of a bell curve, right? Where that bell curve goes up really high, where most of the time the scoring distribution is going to be pretty narrow around those 47.5 points. Maybe it's 43 points, maybe it's 44 points, maybe it's 52 points, but we're not likely to see games way outside of that range. In this particular spot, though, we have a different story shaping up. So Arizona, 4 games this year in which they've scored 17 or fewer points. Arizona, 4 games this year in which they've allowed 15 or fewer points. This game could be a 30, and Seattle's been pretty inconsistent on offense. This game could end up being, a 35-point total between these two teams. But also, Arizona has 5 games in which they've scored 28 plus, including against some good defenses. Arizona has 4 games in which they've allowed 27 plus. So it's certainly possible that this game plays to a 35-point total. It's also certainly possible that this game plays to a 55-point total, a 58-point total, a 62-point total. And if that ends up happening, this ends up being one of the games that you really had to have on this particular weekend. Taking that one step further, Kyler has 5 games this year of 15.8 or fewer DraftKings points, but he also has 4 games of 25 plus DraftKings points. So when you look at quarterbacks priced around Kyler, most of them are not scoring 25 plus DraftKings points in 4 games this season. In fact, we can go up to the higher ends of the price range. Jaden Daniels has a game of 25, a game of 25.2, a game of 28.1, and a game of 28.2. So basically what Kyler has done, except for 800 more in salary. Patrick Mahomes has 0 games on the season of 25 or more DraftKings points. Jordan Love has 2 games on the season north of 25 DraftKings points. CJ Stroud has, I believe it's 0 games on the season north of 25. He has 1 game on the season of north of 25 DraftKings points. And then Brock Purdy, somebody who's always popular, has 3 games on the season north of 25 DraftKings points, none of 28 DraftKings points. So we see like Kyler Murray, you look at his average points per game and you look at these games with 15 points or whatever, and it's easy to say like, I don't really want to go there, but we're trying to win tournaments. Like a barbell approach is not a bad thing for us. A guy like Kyler who, if he scores 17, 18 points, that looks a lot better in the box score, makes us feel better. But that really doesn't win us a tournament any differently than if he scores 15 points or 12 points or 5 points or whatever else Kyler is capable of scoring. And so we want to be thinking about the high-end range. Well, his high-end range is enough to win us a tournament. He's only 6,200. He's not going to be super popular this week. And so he becomes a really interesting piece in this game that's also a barbell type of game. So you stack up this game on a roster, and it ends up playing to the downside. And it's like, okay, I'm not winning a tournament this week. Maybe I'm not even finishing in the money because of this, right? But finishing in the money doesn't make us money over time. Making decisions for finishing in the money doesn't make us money over time. So if Kyler and if this whole game environment, right, underwhelms, that's okay, because even if it just kind of hit in the middle, that's still not winning you a tournament. So yeah, it looks worse if this ends if you finish all the way to the left in the standings because this game just underwhelmed. That looks a little bit worse than if you finish right in the middle of the standings. But in terms of what's making you real money over time, it's no different. On the flip side, if this game plays to the upside, you are creating a much clearer path to a first place finish than a lot of other available games on this slate. So the Kyler side, the Geno side, the wide receivers, the pass catchers, we'll dive deeper into this in the player grid, but and actually we'll dive a little bit into it in the bottom up build as well at the end of this show. But very interesting game where the game total is in the middle, but the range of outcomes is pretty broad. We like games like that for DFS. And then the last game I want to hit on here, San Francisco at Green Bay. So on Wednesday of this week, I was going through the DraftKings app and kind of looking game by game. I went through cheap running back options first, and then I went through expensive wide receivers, and then expensive running backs, and then cheap wide receivers, and then the tight end position, and then the quarterback position, just kind of getting a feel for what the slate provides for us and carving out an initial player pool. And I came out of that exercise with only Christian McCaffrey from this game on my list. And so then we get to Thursday, and I'm writing up my game-by-game DFS interpretations. And I come to this game, and I was like, all right, what do I have on my list so far? Oh, really? Only Christian McCaffrey? I'm not all that interested in a game with the 49ers offense and the Packers offense? That's surprising, right? So I go over and I look at implied team totals, and I see that the 49ers are implied for only 21.75 real-life points. That is typically an offense we would avoid in DFS, let alone a high-priced offense. Like, we're definitely avoiding a high-priced offense that's implied for only 21.75 points. And then even the Packers, again, implied for 24.75. So just not basically against the Vegas totals. My initial instinct of like, yeah, really just Christian McCaffrey is really sharp. Based on how this game is expected to play out, is likeliest to play out, not having interest in individual pieces from this game is really sharp. But then, well, I got a cool thing going on with my hair there. All right. And then, but then I hit this point where I was like, again, really? I'm not all that interested. And so you start thinking about like, yeah, Vegas is saying this. Yeah, the numbers say this. But isn't there a scenario in which the 49ers do really well against the Packers here? Isn't there a scenario in which the Packers do really well in response here? Isn't there a scenario in which this is a 33-30 type of game? And so I think this is a very interesting game to stack up. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey is a viable one-off. Jaden Reed's a viable one-off. Juwan Jennings is a viable one-off. You could pick one-offs from this game. But in terms of trying to win a tournament this week, this is certainly a game that has potential to be one of those that things come together in such a way that you really had to have this game environment. So we hit on the Chiefs being a team that, hey, maybe they just end up scoring a bunch of points and running their offense because they're controlling the game so thoroughly. We talked about Miami and New England being a game that, maybe this becomes competitive through Drake May and it ends up being sort of a back and forth game. We talked about the Lions and the Colts and the Shane Steichen effect. Maybe this one becomes competitive and the Lions are running their normal offense deep into this game. And then we talked about the Cardinals and Seahawks having this broad range of outcomes, but certainly a lot of room to the upside. And San Francisco and Green Bay, with maybe not as broad of a range of outcomes, but also clear room to the upside where building on this game could end up being what puts you on a tournament winning path. So again, if all five of these play out this way, then you're not gaining that much of an edge because yes, your stuff's hitting, but so is other stuff that you're also competing against. But if only one or two of these games sort of play out to this scenario we just painted, but it really plays out to the scenario we just painted, then being on that game could give you a huge edge on this particular week where, scoring and production should be pretty suppressed across the board outside of these one or two spots where things sort of trend in a different direction. So I think it's critical to think about this week and thinking about what are our clearest paths to a first place finish. Building around one of these five games in one way or another is a very interesting way to attack the slate. Okay. Running back position. I want to look at some ownership at the running back position. So I'm going to list off 7 names. All of these guys are projected for 16.4% or higher ownership. Devon Achane, Joe Mixon, Christian McCaffrey, Brian Robinson Jr., James Conner, Kareem Hunt, Kenneth Walker. We now have news that Isaiah Pacheco is not playing, so I would expect Kareem Hunt's projected ownership to go up. Kareem Hunt, who a couple games with 27 touches, 21 plus touches in all but one game when he's been in this lead role. And, 21 plus DraftKings points in like 5 of 7 games, playing against this bad Carolina Panthers run defense. And one of the things I think is interesting with Kareem Hunt, just kind of a side trail, but interesting with Kareem Hunt is typically the concern against the Panthers, and this has played out a lot of times this year, is really the RB2 is the better play against the Panthers because they're cheaper. They often end up seeing as many touches as the RB1 or even more touches than the RB1 because teams control this game against Carolina. And they're like, all right, let's rest our lead back and turn things over. But Isaiah Pacheco should be coming back next week. Isaiah Pacheco should be resuming his role at the front of this Kansas City offense it might make sense for Kansas City, a team that has been willing to give Kareem Hunt 27 touches when the situation calls for it. It might actually make sense for Kansas City this week to say, all right, let's give Kareem Hunt a thank you on the way out the door. Let's give him 25 touches against Carolina. We don't need to rest him for the playoff run or keep him healthy and strong for the playoff run because we've got Isaiah Pacheco coming back. And so I think that they very clearly could see Kareem Hunt see 22, 25 plus touches, which we just typically don't get against this Carolina defense. So it won't surprise me if his ownership goes up. But again, these 7 guys, Achane, Mixon, CMC, Brian Robinson Jr., James Conner, Kareem Hunt, Kenneth Walker, all of them are sharp plays. 6 of these 7 guys are going to be in the player grid. We'll wait till the player grid to see the guy who's not in it. And he's also a guy who I'm not arguing against. So if you check the player grid, you see that one of these guys is not in there. Realize that it's not a guy I'm arguing against. Perfectly fine play, is just not one of the guys on my own list. And so then I also have some others who are kind of below the 16.4% threshold, but I also feel good about. But it kind of illustrates for us that running back, again, is typically the place where we're not going to gain our biggest edge. Running back is kind of the place where if there's 7 running backs who are all projected for 16.4% or more ownership, 6 of these 7 guys are on my list. The other guy very easily could be on my list. What are the chances that all of these guys fail? Probably pretty low. What are the chances that 6 of these guys fail? Probably pretty low. Probably at least 2 running backs from this list are going to hit. And running back, the chalk is more robust. The popular plays are more robust because so much of running back production relies on workload, relies on role. And workload and role are very sticky from week to week at the running back position. So if you go off the board at the running back position for somebody who's lower likelihood to hit, you are now giving yourself a thinner path to that player hitting. And then because of this group of 7 running backs or more, at least 2 of them are likely to hit, you're still not gaining that much of an edge because your guy who you took on more risk for hits, but so does somebody else and somebody else, right? So you're really just joining the same score that some of these popular guys ended up hitting. So just some things to think about at the running back position. There are, like I said, some not lower owned, but some guys below the 16.4% threshold that are on my list this week as well. We'll hit on them in the player grid. But again, just to illustrate, like running back chalk is typically going to be somewhat robust. It's typically going to be somewhat sharp. And so targeting these players, not a bad way to go. Just kind of pulling from this list, not a bad way to go. Then we have the wide receiver position, where already wide receiver scoring is more volatile. And if you could take these players in a vacuum, maybe they would be the best plays, right? But let's use Kayshon Boutte last week as an example. Kayshon Boutte was on my list as like, here's a guy who's seeing 6 targets and they're coming downfield, and he's a pretty fine, like cheap with upside option. He's the kind of play you play at 3% or 5% ownership because he's probably not going to hit. But if he does, he can get you as much as like 18 to 22 DraftKings points with nobody on him. But then you flip over the card, look at ownership projections, and he was projected for 20% ownership. He was projected to be the highest owned wide receiver on the slate. And it's like, oh, well, he's not that good of a play. Here's an opportunity to go ahead and just not play Kayshon Boutte because, again, most of the time he's going to miss. And if he's going to be high owned, then we can just take those misses, right? And so we're seeing a lot of that at wide receiver where it's like, yeah, this isn't a great play, but it's the best of a bad group of plays, so that's where I'll go to. But that slight tipping point tips like this guy to be slightly better than a bunch of other plays, but tips ownership dramatically in that direction because everybody's looking for the, quote, best play, the better play of the bunch. And so you get this heavy ownership on guys who really don't warrant heavy ownership. So let's look at the top of the wide receiver position. Now, there's only 2 guys implied or projected for 19.7% or higher ownership right now at this point in the week. That's Jacoby Myers against Denver and Cortland Sutton against the Raiders. Jacoby Myers against Denver, against the Denver pass defense. Even the Las Vegas pass defense has been so good against wide receivers. Cortland Sutton against them. Now, again, I can see the case being made for each of these guys. Like, yeah, this guy's a slightly better play than the other plays priced around them. But then when you look at, do I want to play them at high ownership, right? That's a question you have to ask yourself. But just recognize that both of these are, the Broncos are not an aggressive offense, and Sutton doesn't always have the heavy volume role, and it's a tough matchup. Jacoby Myers always has the heavy volume role, but you've got Gardner Minshew under center playing against the Denver defense, right? So each of these guys have a lot of holes in their game for guys who are going to be the 2 highest owned wide receivers on the slate. Then we have Calvin Ridley against Houston. Now, I don't mind Calvin Ridley because the ceiling is high, right? He had 3 games this year, 24 plus DraftKings points. The ceiling is high. He can hit for big plays. The floor is low. Typically, we prefer to trend toward volatile plays when they're lower owned and avoid them when they're higher owned. Because if a play is volatile, if they have a broad range of outcomes and they're high owned and they score their 8-point game, that really helps you quite a bit in tournaments. Whereas if a player is volatile, they have a broad range of outcomes and they're low owned and they score their 25-pointer, that also helps you a ton in tournaments. But in a vacuum, in terms of just like, is Calvin Ridley a good play from a ceiling perspective? At his price tag, he absolutely is. And so I won't argue too hard against him. But again, just to highlight, we have, and I won't argue too hard against him. I have him in the player grid. But we do have Calvin Ridley with Will Levis at quarterback against a good Houston defense at high ownership, right? And then we have Juwan Jennings in a low total game against a good secondary on a team in the 49ers where week-to-week target volume has not been sticky for several years. So back-to-back weeks of 11 targets for Juwan Jennings. Maybe he gets there again this week, but the likeliest scenario based on everything we know about the San Francisco offense, the likeliest scenario is that he doesn't get there this week. And so, again, a play with a lot of holes in it. And then we get down to JSN and DK Metcalf in this game environment that we like for the upside. Both of them below 14% predicted ownership. Amon-Ra St. Brown coming off his first big game, of the season where he had, he's cost 8,300. You love him to get 30 plus points. He has a couple games up into the 28-point range. One of them was a 31-29 back and forth shootout against Minnesota. One of them was a game against Tampa. It was also close and competitive. It's the only loss for the Lions. And Jared Goff threw the ball over 50 times in that game. And then we have the random game last week where they just controlled the game and they, you had this 41-pointer. But basically, our likeliest outcome for Amon-Ra St. Brown is that he puts up another 18, 20, 21 points as he's been doing for most of the season. CeeDee Lamb with Cooper Rush. And so going through this list, you kind of see that things get pretty thin pretty quickly at wide receiver. There's lots of shaky plays in there. And so it's a good week to consider hunting lower owned wide receivers. So typically at the bottom of the player grid, I have my cheap with upside plays at wide receiver, because as we get into this point in the season, there are the Kavontae Turpin plays, the Kayshon Boutte plays, the plays where you're like, okay, this guy, the Calvin Austin plays. Calvin Austin's been maddening. He touchdown last night, a couple of big plays last night. I've been on him all the time on the main slate. He keeps not hitting on the main slate. But again, these guys who is like broad range of outcomes, but they can hit, right? Kavontae Turpin's the guy we've highlighted all season. Calvin Austin, the guy we've highlighted all season. Kayshon Boutte, the guy we were highlighting last week, as these guys who, their typical outcome is going to be 3, 6, 7 points, but they can hit for 20. And if nobody's on them and they hit for 20 at this cheap price tag, that's great, right? A lot of times you need that one play this deep in the season where pricing's tighter in order to win a tournament. So typically we have that cheap with upside category in the player grid. But this week, it's low owned with upside. And I basically just went through the lower owned players in the early ownership projections and pulled in some of the ones like if there's this much shakiness in the higher owned wide receivers, why not take some shaky plays that have a lot of upside and much lower ownership? And so we'll wait to the player grid to highlight the individual plays in there. But I think that, again, looking at the state of the slate, the picture on the puzzle box, I think that that's a very sharp way to approach this week, is to think about, okay, I'll play some chalk at running back, or at least just play my favorite plays at running back. I will build around the two places where we can gain major separation is building around one of these game environments, whether it's Kansas City, whether it's the Lions, whether Lions potentially with a bring back, whether it's Drake May-led stacks against the Dolphins, whether it's Arizona and Seattle or San Francisco and Green Bay stacks. Do something differently in that regard and how I'm attacking game environments. And then I will also hunt just through ownership projections and say, okay, who's low owned and has some ceiling at the wide receiver position? And that's kind of how I will be attacking this week and looking at this week. And then last thing I want to hit on in terms of how this slate shapes up, is these two cheap tight ends who can unlock things. So we have Travis Kelce up at the high end. And then the question becomes, does he get enough volume? Like I really probably prefer Kelce in Mahomes stacks. You can play him without Mahomes, but if Kelce's getting enough volume, it's probably a game where, because he's not hitting for huge plays, right? Maybe he can have a 2-touchdown game on 8 or 9 targets, but he's not a big play threat at this point in his career. So ideally, you want Travis Kelce seeing 10, 12, 14 targets. that probably means Patrick Mahomes is throwing the ball 35 times. And if he's throwing the ball 35 times against the Panthers, he's got a pretty good shot at having a big game, right? So Mahomes is expensive enough that you don't have to play him with Kelsey, but that's kind of the story that you're telling is Mahomes has a big game alongside Kelsey. So Kelsey's in play, but also, like how you play him matters. Brock Bowers is in play from a ceiling perspective. George Kittle is in play. Probably want to tie him into a game stack there. And Trey McBride is in play, although in both, well, we'll save that for the bottom-up build. But yeah, Trey McBride is in play. Then we get down to the 4,300 to 4,000 range, working from the top down. So you got Sam Laporta, who's probably going to score single-digit points, but has an outside shot at 12 to 15 and an extreme outside shot at 20 plus. You have TJ Hawkinson, who's probably going to score single-digit points, but has an outside shot at 12 to 15 points and an extreme outside shot at 20 plus. Jonnu Smith probably scores single-digit points, outside shot at 12 to 15, extreme outside shot at 20 plus. Hunter Henry probably scores single-digit points, outside shot at 12 to 15, extreme outside shot at 20 plus. So what if, from this group of 4 tight ends, only one of them scores 12 or 13, the other 3 score single digits, nobody posts a big game? Well, if that ends up being the case, Theo Johnson at 2,900, who's typically going to score 6 to 7 points, but can also score around 15, and Luke Schoonmaker, who has 6 and 10 targets in the 2 games that Blake Ferguson has missed, and cost 2,500, right? He can score. His typical output is going to be 7, 8 points, 6, 7, 8 points, but he can score 12 to 15. So if we end up with a scenario where these 4K to 43, if we end up with a scenario where Kelsey doesn't see the volume and he puts up, maybe he puts up 16, 17 points, but that's not winning you a tournament at his price tag. And maybe McBride doesn't have his big game. And then these guys in this 4K to 4,300 range, like all score single digits, or maybe only one of them goes above single digits and doesn't really take off. All of a sudden, these 2 cheap tight ends who can unlock so much on your roster, and they can score 6 to 14 points. They have outside pathways to 18 to 20 points. They're basically the same profile as cheap wide receiver, except that this week doesn't give us a lot of cheap wide receivers to express a lot of confidence in. They can open up so much on your roster. So I think that those are 2 interesting guys. When you look at the cheap wide receivers and you say, who among the cheap wide receivers can go for 16 plus? There aren't that many. And then what if none of them do? And again, what if these tight ends who are, 1,100 more, 1,400 more, 15, 1,800 more than these 2 cheap tight ends, what if all of them score single digits or low double digits? Well, all of a sudden these 2 guys end up being really valuable in what they can open up. So we always want to think about what can win a tournament, right? Last week we had Jonnu Smith in the player grid. He scored 31 DraftKings points. Last week, Taysom Hill scored 46 DraftKings points after being featured in the player grid week in and week out. Didn't have him last week, playing single entry 3 max last week instead of MME, and so overlooked Taysom Hill. Brock Bowers scored 34 DraftKings points last week. If a score like that is produced and you're saying, hey, I've got this 2,500 guy who can score 12, you're not going to win a tournament, right? So you still have to think through the lens of like what else can be scored on this slate, because similar with like Tommy DeVito this week, if Tommy DeVito scores 16, 18 points, only 4K in salary, and no quarterback scores like 25 plus, well, Tommy DeVito is doing so much for your rosters. On the flip side, if we get like a 34-point score from quarterback and you're getting 14 from Tommy DeVito and you're like, yeah, great salary savings, well, that's not helping you in a tournament, right? So we have to think about that, especially at the onesie position, which you can play 2 tight ends, but the onesie positions being tight end, defense, and quarterback, that if you get the guy who only goes for 12, 14, and you're just getting them for the salary savings, that can still end up hurting you if somebody posts a had to have it score at the position. So you got to look at the tight end position and think, do I think anybody posts a had to have it score? Then you need to either target what you think could be had to have it scores, or you need to say, all right, I don't think there's going to be any had to have it scores, or I'll place a bet on this roster that there won't be any had to have it scores, and that just the cheap points I get here and what I open up elsewhere on my roster ends up being valuable. So I think a very sharp way to go this week is considering that approach. All right, we're making it. I think I make it through without sliding off screen and blowing my nose, but we've got the bottom up build left to wrap up this podcast. So bottom up build, we're going to build a roster with a 44K salary cap. It's great thought exercise. Also, if you want to participate, build a roster with a 44K salary cap, you can join the bottom up build contest. You can find it linked in my player grid or in the OWS Discord in the BUB Challenge channel. Rules are simple. Build with a 44K salary cap. It's a free entry. There are real prizes, $150 on OWS to first place, $100 second place, $50 to third place, special Discord blue color to the winner. So you ever see anybody in Discord with that blue color, they are a bottom-up build winner. And again, it's just a great way to sharpen your mind and to think about how you can pack as much upside into a roster as possible. So we talk about this every week, but in the past, not so much this year where scoring's down across the board, but in the past, we've had plenty of weeks in which the winner of the bottom-up build contest scored 200 plus DraftKings points with 44K in salary spent. We've had weeks in which the bottom-up build winner would have won some smaller field contests on that particular week, 50K salary cap contest, because people figure out how to pack as much upside as they can into these 44K salary cap builds. So just a cool thought exercise, and gives us an opportunity to do something fun as a community, do something fun here at the end of this podcast, and also talk through a few more players and angles at this point in the podcast. So players and angles I want to talk through, I've highlighted this Seattle-Arizona game. What I think is really interesting about the Seattle-Arizona game is Marvin Harrison Jr. has hit twice this year, a 26-pointer and a 32-pointer. In both of those games, Trey McBride had his two best games of the year, an 18-pointer and a 24-pointer from Trey McBride. So when Marvin Harrison Jr. has hit, it has been because the Cardinals' passing attack is hitting. When Trey McBride has hit, it has been because the Cardinals' passing attack is hitting. These two have been heavily correlated so far throughout the season, which means that Kyler Murray plus Marvin Harrison Jr. plus Trey McBride gives us this opportunity to cover 3 spots on our roster while getting one thing right. So I touched on this in the block party with Pete Overzet, but I want to touch on it again right here, why that's so valuable for us in DFS, because DFS is a game of understanding how to turn the math in our favor. So if we're trying to get, both times that these 3 players have hit, they've kept you on a 200 plus point pace in terms of just like the salary spent. If you could spend 50K in salary and get 4X that 50K, you would get 200 points, right? So Kyler plus Marvin Harrison Jr. plus Trey McBride. The 2 times they've hit, they've kept you on a 211-point pace and a 221-point pace. That's not easy to do, especially on this season, right? So let's look at trying to get 3 players right who are completely uncorrelated. So in the past, we'll even use this number, right? This year, it's not totally been the case. This year it's been more like 15 to 20% because DraftKings has gotten more aggressive with their pricing and scoring has been down across the NFL. But in the past, DraftKings has always priced players in such a way that they'll score roughly 4X their salary, roughly 25% of the time. Or in other words, they'll keep you on about a 200-point pace about 25% of the time. So Kyler, Marvin Harrison Jr., and Trey McBride, they've done it twice this year in 10 games. That's 20%. So why is this any better than anything else? Well, if you have 3 uncorrelated plays, the chances of player 1, who's got a 25% chance of going for about 4X, and player 2, who has that 25% chance, and player 3, who has a 25% chance, uncorrelated players all hitting on the same week together. The chances of that happening are 1.56%. And if we go down to the way things have really been this year with pricing of like about 20% of the time, maybe even lower than that for most players, well, then you're at 0.8% of the time. So why even 25% likelihood of going for 4X, you're talking about you build a roster, you build 100 rosters, 1.5 times out of that 100, you're going to get these 3 players right together. But in the context of what has been provided this year, you build 100 rosters with Kyler and McBride and Marvin Harrison Jr., or said differently, you let this play out 100 times, 20% of the time, you're going to get these 3 guys right together. So this is the power of correlated bets, is that you're dramatically tilting the math in your favor. Instead of something that's going to happen for your rosters 1.5% of the time, you jump all the way up to something that's going to happen for your roster 20% of the time. Now, not to say that this exact number of 20% is going to hold throughout the season, but just to illustrate that Kyler plus McBride plus Marvin Harrison Jr. has established already this year that this is a correlated bet. And with a barbell type of setup in this game environment, if it plays to the far right, if it plays to the upside, all of a sudden it's playing to a scenario where Kyler plus Marvin Harrison Jr. plus Trey McBride makes a lot of sense. Now, also, Trey McBride, In the games where he's hit, Kyler is hit. In the games where he's hit, Marvin Harrison Jr. is hit. So I'm not necessarily isolating, because of how inexpensive Kyler is and because of the ceiling that Kyler has, I'm not necessarily isolating Trey McBride as a one-off play on my rosters. I primarily want to play him with Kyler Murray, and then I probably want to play this whole stack together. So there's other ways you can do it. You can mix in James Conner and have a 4-player stack, especially in smaller field contests. You could do that. You could take one of these pass catchers out and put James Conner in their place. But on this particular roster, we're going to go Kyler plus Marvin Harrison Jr. plus Trey McBride. Now, I built this before we got the news that Isaiah Pacheco was going to be out this week. Excuse me. So I'm going to do something a little bit different here. I might change this. I would probably change this with the Kareem Hunt news, but this gives us an opportunity to talk about something interesting, and that is Bucky Irving plus Rachaad White. So Bucky Irving plus Rachaad White, since Chris Godwin went down. Now, Mike Evans coming back this week, but Mike Evans has not been the heavy volume guy in this Liam Cohen offense. Mike Evans has been the 6 to 8 targets on the outside, try to hit for big plays guy in this offense. Chris Godwin, what they lost with Chris Godwin is the guy who they can use underneath in order to march the field, right? That's why we were seeing 10 targets, 12 targets, 15 targets from Chris Godwin. So since Chris Godwin went down, the Bucs have turned this backfield into their chain movers, right? So Rachaad White and Bucky Irving are obviously both getting carries, typically under 10 carries, but they're both getting, 7, 9, sometimes 12 carries, whatever it is. But they're also both seeing targets. And so Bucky Irving plus Rachaad White have combined for, this is from the DFS interpretations. Now I'm pulling this off the top of my head, but I think it was in 3 of their last 4 games, they've combined for scores of 32, 35, or 36, something like that, and 45. Well, at a combined price tag of 10.7K, they're basically keeping you on like 170 to 215 or 220 point pace, something like that, in 75% of their games. So there's 2 ways to look at this. One is if these guys are keeping you on this 170 to 220 point pace, well, the production's probably not going to be split exactly down the middle, which means that one of these guys has a pretty good shot at approaching 4x salary multiplier. One of these guys has a pretty good shot at approaching that 4x pace. But then also in smaller field contests, we have had a 25% run out of both of these guys hitting together, these guys combining to keep you on a 200-point pace. Again, individual players are typically priced in such a way that they're going to do that 25% of the time. So if you can get 2 guys together that have done that 25% of the time, that's helping you quite a bit. Another example of that we've used in recent weeks is Devon Achane and Tyreek Hill, right? When Devon Achane has had a role and has had Tua under center, he's hit at an outrageous rate, but also he and Tyreek Hill have hit together over 25% of the time. So these spots where you can say, hey, I'm getting basically what most people are getting from their individual plays, but I'm getting it on 2 plays. So small sample size with Bucky Irving and Rachaad White, but it's not like we're saying, hey, 25% of the time they hit for a 200-point pace, and the rest of the time they hit for a 100-point pace or 125-point pace, right? The rest of the time, they're still hitting 75% of the time they're hitting for scores that are going to help you in the current meta of DFS scoring and what first place rosters typically look like. So Bucky Irving plus Rachaad White, not something I would do in large field play, but in smaller field contests where basically letting other people make mistakes is one of the best ways to make money. Getting these 2 together gives you a pretty high probability bet at keeping yourself on that 200+ point pace. With a tournament winning pace still in the card. So this is a very interesting starting point where we have Kyler Murray, Marvin Harrison Jr., Trey McBride, Bucky Irving, and Rachaad White. Jackson Smith and Jigba is our bring back on this particular roster. So still betting on that game environment. We've basically got 2 bets that we're placing right now. One is that Cardinals and Seahawks shoots out. One is that the Buccaneers do well in this game and continue to run their offense through these running backs. And then one last bet that we're going to make is Kevontae Turpin plus Luke Schoonmaker. These 2, not necessarily a bet I wanted to put together, but I needed this in a 44K salary cap roster in order to not sacrifice upside at other spots. I needed the cheap tight end and the cheap wide receiver. So we can look at these guys as like a 5.8K player and basically ask, like, a guy who's 5.8K, look at most of our options at 5.8K, at wide receiver, at running back. Most of our options in this range, I guess, throw out Kareem Hunt, throw out Bucky Irving, throw out Rachaad White. So wide receivers in the 5.8K range. Basically, they're going to get you single digits a lot of the time. They're going to get you 12 to 15 points a lot of the time. And every once in a while, they're going to spike for 20 to 25 points. Well, that's basically the profile that we're getting with these 2 guys where, again, Kevontae Turpin, a guy that we've highlighted throughout the season as a guy who can score from anywhere on the field. So he had 0 points against Philly. He had 6.6 points a week before that against Atlanta. He had 3.7 points against San Francisco, 6 against Detroit, 8.4 against Pittsburgh. But he also had 17.6 last week. He had 14.2 in week 3 against Baltimore. And so if Shoemaker scores 12 points and then you add 6 points from Kevontae Turpin, that's 18 points. That's a pretty good score from a 5.8K player. If you get 7 points from Shoemaker and you get 5 points from Kevontae Turpin, that's 12 points. Not a great score, but not too far out of line with what a lot of people are going to get from their 5.8K player. And then there's this outside scenario where these two combine for 25 plus points, which again is going to be more than people get from their 8.5 for their 5.8K player. So an interesting pairing here that isn't something I would necessarily go out of my way to play, but also not something that I would take off of a roster if I ended up with it, because it actually does make quite a bit of sense. And it gets a really fun setup here, and that we're really betting on 3 things total altogether on this roster. We're betting on the Cowboys passing attack having some level of success while having to work, in limited weapons, having to work through these lower end guys. We're betting on Cardinals and Seahawks shooting out, and we are betting on the Bucs continuing to run their offense through their backfield, having a good game here. Wrap this up with the Broncos defense, which there's 5 really good defenses playing against mistake-prone quarterbacks, but the Broncos are the cheapest of the bunch. So wrap it up with the Broncos defense. We end up spending $43.9K in salary, got 6.1K left over, which, you can kind of use this as a skeleton to build from, or your own bottom-up build as a skeleton to build from, and realize how much additional upside you can build in around a starting point like this. So with that, we're going to get out of here. Thanks for hanging out. As always, dive into my position by position interests on the slate in my player grid in the scroll. So hopefully I'll see you there. Make sure you check out Searching for Ceiling with Lord Reeves and Hilo on the 1 Week Season podcast feed and YouTube feed. Check out Solo Ship with myself and Squirrel Patrol. And I will see you on the site throughout the weekend. And I'll see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.